close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New Testament. And up until tonight, we have been primarily looking at developments that occurred under the Persian Empire. And tonight, we're going to begin to shift our focus a little bit to the Greek influence. And it would honestly be almost impossible to overstate the importance of the Greek influence on the changes that took place between the world of the Old Testament that we're reading about in Ezra and Nehemiah and the world of the New Testament that we step into in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The Greeks had such a profound influence on life and culture and the political setting and everything else that takes place in and around Palestine that it's really impossible to quantify it. But when we think about the Greeks, we're presenting this in an order that I don't want to mislead you into thinking that these kingdoms existed one after another after another. They overlap tremendously. Okay, so the Babylonian kingdom was a kingdom during the time when the Assyrian Empire ruled the world. And Greece was already a series of fairly powerful city-states toward the end of the Assyrian period. And then the Babylonians arise, and for a couple of generations, they are the sort of the primary power, at least in the biblical world, but the Greeks are still growing and developing during that time. And then, of course, the Persians overthrow the Babylonians, and the Greeks continue to grow and develop, and Greek history overlaps all of this history. So when we step into Greece at this point, I don't want you to think that Greece just sort of springs out of nowhere. It's just that they come into our story almost as though out of nowhere, but they have a history that predates what we're talking about by centuries and centuries. Okay? In fact, by this time, the Iliad and the Odyssey are old. Okay? Alexander was reading the Iliad and the Odyssey as sort of ancient literature in his time. Okay? As a matter of fact, incidentally, it's chronicled that he took copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey with him on his conquest of the world as reading material. But let's talk for just a moment about who Alexander is and where he comes from, because even though he is generally considered a Greek conqueror, he was Greek by choice and by culture, but by ethnicity and background, he's actually Macedonian. Macedonia, if you look on a map, and you may be able to see it on this map, I don't know, everything's so small. Macedonia is to the north of the Greek peninsula proper. And so when you think about, if you studied in world history in school, the Greek city-states, you think about Athens and Sparta and some of those are all in the peninsula to the south of Macedon. Macedon is up into Europe. And it was by and large sort of considered to be a backwater sort of an area by the more cosmopolitan city-states like Athens, for example, who would have looked at Macedonia as, farmland. But Philip of Macedon was the king, and he had succeeded in forging together an alliance of the Macedonian kingdom with all of the Greek city-states, with the exception of Sparta, in order to resist continuing attempts by Persia to conquer Greece and Greek-controlled territory. Well, Philip dies in 336 BC. In fact, he's murdered. And he leaves behind as his heir his son, Alexander. Now, as I said, Alexander's Macedonian by birth, but Alexander is very, very much immersed in Greek culture. As a matter of fact, Aristotle himself was personally a tutor to Alexander. His father had hired him to come and teach his son, and so Alexander learns at the feet of Aristotle, who of course was a student of Plato, who himself was a student of Socrates, and so Alexander is riding on a very fine pedigree of Greek learning at the very beginning. And he was a very willing student. He was very much interested in the learning of the Greeks and the philosophy and the scientific inquiries and things of that nature that are going on by the learned minds down in the Greek peninsula. And so when he decides to take his father's mission to defeat the Persians on as a conquest, he not only arms his people and puts together an army, but he also assembles an entourage of scientists, historians, librarians, people of every branch of learning to accompany him, because he's not only interested in military conquest, primarily of Persia at this point, but he's also interested in learning what he can from the places that he intends to visit, and taking from them their languages and their cultures and their learnings and their insights into things like science and mathematics and history and things of that nature. And so he takes a pretty good group of scholars with him. And in about 334, he crosses, I knew that was going to happen. Hold on just a second. Let me give your map back to you. I have not mastered the art of telling a Mac not to go to sleep and having it listen to me. So anyway, if it does it again, somebody signal me and I'll try to turn it back on. They crossed the Hellespont, which is also known as the Dardanelles, which is the strait that separates Europe and Asia. In other words, if you can look up here on the map and you see the little narrow strip of water between what is now Turkey and the Greek peninsula, that's the Dardanelles or the Hellespont. Okay? If you see that little body of water that always to me looks sort of like a rat crouching down, the rat's tail is the strip of water I'm talking about. He crosses, y'all are looking at that now, aren't you? It does look like a rat. He crosses the Hellespont and begins his conquest. Now, you've heard the famous story of Caesar crossing the Rubicon when he advanced on Rome, and it was said that once he crossed the Rubicon, there was no going back. Well, for Alexander, some years before, it was the crossing of the Hellespont that was the point of no return. And so he crosses into Asia Minor, and he takes the city of Troy. Now, Troy has a long pedigree in Greek history, right? The Trojan Wars. The Iliad itself is written about the Trojan Wars, and he takes Troy, and the first thing he does is sacrifice to the Greek heroes. That's a signal that he is beginning a conquest of war. And that is a signal primarily to Darius, the king of the Persians, that I'm coming for you. Now, Darius doesn't take him all that seriously. In other words, he does not lead the main body of his Persian army against Alexander. Instead, he commissions a cavalry and an army that's made up primarily of mercenaries, a good many of whom are Greek mercenaries. And they meet Alexander at the Battle of Granicus. At this battle, Alexander has a fight on his hands. And he wins narrowly, but he does win. And to make his point, primarily I would say to the people of Asia Minor, who were by and large Greek in culture, he massacres all of the Greek mercenaries. And he says, look, if you're Greek, you better stand with us. That's essentially the statement. Now, Alexander is often depicted as a man who spread learning and culture throughout the ancient world, and that's not an unfair characterization. But we shouldn't overlook the fact that he was a man of war who was not above committing what would be considered today some pretty bad atrocities if it was necessary in order for him to establish the military conquest that he wanted to establish. And so he massacres the Greek mercenaries, and then he begins to proceed further east. Now, as he's proceeding farther and farther east, he's getting closer and closer to the land that is more and more important to Persia. Now remember that Persia is primarily based in Mesopotamia and east of there. Okay, so Mesopotamia on the map, I don't know if you can see it or not, it's essentially where modern day Iraq is. So from there east is the beating heart of Persia. And the closer he gets to that area, the closer he's getting to the heart of Persia and the more of a threat he's perceived. Okay? So by the next year, 333, he is fighting the Battle of Issus, and the Battle of Issus is of extreme importance for a number of reasons. Number one, it gives him access to the city of Damascus. This is the same Damascus, by the way, that we read about in Scripture from Old Testament times, one of the oldest cities known to the world. It's important because that is a major Persian outpost in this part of the world. It's also important because in this battle, number one, Alexander routs the Persians. Number two, he conquers, as I said, Damascus, which was not only an important city, but it also was home to a massive hoard of wealth that he now has access to fund his further progress into Persian territory. And perhaps even most important of all, he's able to capture a number of Darius's immediate family members and hold them as hostages. Now he has bargaining chips of the highest order. And he can essentially call the shots with Darius and do what he wants to do. Rather than proceeding farther east at this point, though, he decides to proceed south. And he goes south down to the coast of Palestine. Does anybody want to venture a guess why the coast of Palestine was important?
Supply lines.
Supply lines is precisely right. Specifically, supply lines by way of Phoenician shipping. The cities on the northern part of the Palestine coast were occupied by the Phoenicians. Tyre and Sidon, those cities, there were 5 principal cities of the Phoenicians, and the Phoenicians were the seagoing traders of the Mediterranean in the ancient world. Now, they were pledged by way of loyalty to Darius and the Persian Empire. And Alexander knows that if he can get the Phoenicians on his side, now he has a way of communicating back with Greece about as quickly as it can be done in the ancient world by way of Phoenician ships, and receiving and sending supplies and messages and reinforcements and all of those sorts of things. Also, on the same subject of supply lines, the Phoenicians not only control the coastline and the shipping on the Mediterranean, but they also have significant power over the land trade routes that run through Palestine. Now, if you've been listening to me babble for very long in any of my classes, you've probably heard me say at some point or another that there was an ancient trade route that runs north to south through Palestine, that goes down south to Egypt and goes up and north over the Arabian Peninsula and then turns east and goes down into Mesopotamia. And it was a major trade route of the ancient world where things were coming from the east, like spices and silks and things of that nature, and going to Egypt, and things coming from Egypt and going back to the east. And this trade route was incredibly important to the economy, not only of Palestine, but of every ancient major power in this part of the world. It was literally the artery of trade. And the Phoenicians have a significant amount of control of this trade route by virtue of their status as merchants. So if he can get control of Phoenicia, he essentially has the supply line that he needs to advance his conquest farther. Well, he reaches out to the Phoenician cities, and all but one of them jump ship and join his conquest. The one that did not was the city of Tyre. Tyre was a very unique city because there was Tyre on the mainland, and there was also an island off the coast that was built into a fortified fortress. And the people, after having been besieged several times in ancient history, probably most recently by Nebuchadnezzar, had learned that they could run across a causeway to the island and hold up on the island, and they were basically impregnable. And so Alexander comes, he lays siege to Tyre on the land. They pull the old trick, run across the causeway, destroy the causeway, hole up on the island. They're not going to run out of supplies for the simple reason that they have ships. They can go for supplies all over the Mediterranean, and they can stay on that island essentially about as long as they need to. But they have never come up against somebody like Alexander before. And so Alexander destroys Tyre on the mainland. And he uses the structures, the stones and the wood and all of that sort of thing, to build another causeway out to the island where he and his soldiers go and lay siege to the Tyre on the island, conquer them with the help of the other Phoenicians and their navy, which is probably something that the folks of Tyre weren't counting on. So he conquers Tyre. Now, that's all interesting and all, but what does it have to do with our story? What happens while he's conquering Tyre, at least according to Josephus, is of supreme interest to our story, because it takes him 7 months to conquer Tyre, and while he's encamped around Tyre, Alexander sends an embassy to Jerusalem, and he says to the Jews in Jerusalem, you need to pledge loyalty to Alexander and send supplies and reinforcements to me and my army. At this point, the high priest in Jerusalem is a man named Jaddas, and Jaddas sends back word and says, no, I have pledged my loyalty to Darius, and I will not forsake my loyalty while he is in the land of the living. Well, you can imagine that Alexander didn't like that very much. And so Alexander becomes very angry, at least in Josephus' account, he becomes very angry, and he says, all right, that's the way it's going to be. When I finish destroying Tyre, I'm going to march to Jerusalem, and everything I do to Tyre, I'm going to do to Jerusalem and more, and I'm going to make them a lesson to everyone in the area as to who your loyalty should belong to. Well, he finishes with Tyre. Did it go off? All right. He finishes with Tyre, and he marches south. He lays siege to Gaza. By the way, who lived in that part of the world in ancient Israelite history? That's Philistine land. 5 cities of the Philistines, Gaza was one of them. He lays siege to Gaza, and then he comes up to Jerusalem. This is where Josephus' account is most interesting, because in Josephus' account, when Alexander comes to Jerusalem, he finds not the city holed up and prepared for war, but the gates of the city are open. And Jaddas and the priests come out to meet him, not with swords and spears, but clothed in white, and bearing only a scroll of the prophet Daniel. The high priest is dressed in his high priestly garb, and according to Josephus, Alexander kneels down and does obeisance to the God of whom Jaddas is the high priest. And then he is escorted into the city, where he has read the story of the prophet Daniel, and particularly probably what we have is chapter 8, where Daniel prophesies that the Greeks would overthrow the Persians, and assuming himself to be the one prophesied of, and also telling his army that he had had a dream in which he had met Jaddas, and that the God of the Israelites would give him victory, he then offers sacrifices to the God of heaven. He does not destroy the city of Jerusalem. In fact, he offers the Israelites essentially the same deal they had under the Persians. He exempts them from taxes every 7th year, and he extends an invitation for as many of them as want to join his army in his conquest and go off to conquer the rest of the world. And so Jerusalem is spared. From Jerusalem, Alexander proceeds south in 331 to Egypt. Now this is interesting. Remember, I told you that Alexander was a committed Greek, at least in terms of his adopted culture. Here's where the cracks begin, that I think ultimately led to his downfall. When he comes to Egypt, he is received as a deliverer. The Egyptians hate the Persians. They're tired of them. They've been fighting them off for years and years and years. The Persians are always trying to conquer Greece, and they're sick of them, and they hail Alexander as a deliverer. And he comes into, I believe it was Memphis, and he is told that he is the prophesied son of Ammon, the Egyptian god, which would make him a pharaoh. He accepts this title and parades around in Egyptian garb and lets the Egyptians know that he is their deliverer and he is one of them and he is the son of Ammon. Well, that's all well and good for the Egyptians. How do you think the Greek army that he was leading took it? Not so very well. Because remember that they're committed to the Greek pantheon. And that is, those are the correct gods in their mind. And now they've seen him at Jerusalem bow down and do obeisance to this strange god of the Israelites. And now here he is in Egypt sacrificing to the Egyptian gods and proclaiming himself the son of Ammon. And then as he goes farther east, they're going to see him continue to adopt various different traits of the land and give credence to the gods of the different places that he goes. And it simply doesn't sit well. And what's happening here is that over time, a number of little resentments are building up against Alexander within his own ranks. And it eventually comes to a head when he gets over as far as India. But now that's several years in the future. Having conquered Egypt without really so much as a fight, he comes back north, and then he begins to proceed east. He marches into Babylon, and in Babylon he is received very much the way Cyrus was received, as a deliverer. The folks of Babylon, especially the Chaldeans, that is the wise men and the priests, are not so sure they like these Persian kings who, in their view, don't give adequate reverence, especially to Marduk, the god that was most preeminent in Babylon. And Alexander comes in and tells them, that he believes that Marduk should be worshipped and honored, and that the temple should be refurbished, and all of these sorts of things, which is just music to the ears of the Chaldeans. And so they welcome him in with open arms. Another little strike against him to his own army, right? He ends up conquering all four of the capitals. There were four capitals, by the way, of the ancient Persian Empire. He conquers all four of them. Babylon is one. Susa is another, or Shushan. In Esther, depending on your translation, it'll say Shushan or Susa. And then he goes to the city of Persepolis. Persepolis is an interesting one because it was said to be the richest city of the ancient world at that time. And there was said to be vastly unimaginable wealth there. And according to the accounts that we have, Alexander does something very strange there. He marches into the city and he massacres the men and enslaves the women and children, which is very unusual for Alexander. That's not typically what he did. Some have suggested that perhaps he did this because Persepolis was the crown jewel of the Persian Empire, and he was sending a message to any holdouts that were supporting Persian power that I've just conquered the crown of your empire, and not just conquered it, but utterly abased it. It now belongs to me. But along the way, he begins to behave more and more like the Persians. And his own army doesn't like it. And he marches on further east into the Punjab region of India. And you can sort of see, if you can see the lines, they march all over in there. And if any of you have been or have friends or relations who have been stationed in that part of the world during recent military conflicts, I think anybody that's ever been there would tell you right quick that that is a very rugged, difficult part of the world to move around in. And imagine doing so without the aid of motorized vehicles. They're marching on foot, on horseback, perhaps camels, what have you. And his army eventually gives out and they say, we've gone as far as we're going to go. We're going no further. And so he ends his conquest. Now, Alexander and his army start back home, and along the way he dies at the age of 33. His entire conquest happens in a span of about 11 years, beginning when he was 22 years old. Now, for some of y'all, that doesn't seem like much, but for those of us that have a bunch of gray hair or no hair, and we think about where we were when we were 22, to imagine that between 22 and 33 we had conquered the known world, that's virtually unfathomable to me. But that's essentially what this man had done. All the ancient powers of that part of the world were now under his sway. Problem is, when he dies, there's no heir. He has married a Bactrian wife named Roxana, and she is pregnant. But he has no heir. And so there is a power struggle among his chief generals, and out of the power struggle eventually emerge four primary powers. And they are Antigonus, Ptolemy Lagus, Cassander, and Lysimachus. As it turns out, they divide up more or less the empire between them. And, well, let's leave Antigonus to last. Ptolemy takes essentially what is Egypt and the southern part of Palestine. Cassander takes Macedonia. Lysimachus takes Thrace. And Antigonus takes everything else, which is a whole lot of land. If you think about that, it's essentially from about the middle of Palestine east. All of that land. And he becomes quite wealthy and powerful pretty quickly. And the others perceive that he is setting himself up to undercut them and take over the whole thing and make himself essentially Alexander II. By the way, in the midst of this power struggle, Cassander conspires to have Roxana and her baby, who was the heir to Alexander, killed. And so there is now no heir to Alexander. And Antigonus seems to be setting himself up to become the heir de facto to Alexander. So the other three ally themselves against him. And at the head of their allied army is a man by the name of Seleucus, who is actually a general of Ptolemy's army. They overthrow Antigonus, and Seleucus ends up essentially controlling most of the land that had been Antigonus's land. Did he go to sleep again? I think we're probably more or less done with it for tonight. I think the bell's going to get us here shortly anyway. Seleucus ends up controlling the majority of the land that had been under the sway of Antigonus, which means for the purposes of our story, we're really not worried about Cassander. He's in Greece. We're really not worried about Lysimachus. He is in Thrace, which is north of Macedonia. It's Seleucus and Ptolemy that we have to deal with. Initially, for the first several years, Palestine is controlled by Ptolemy. And for the most part, we're going to talk more about this in detail in future classes. For the most part, that was a relatively tranquil arrangement. We really don't have a whole lot of material that tells us about what's going on with the Jews during this period. But eventually, the descendants of Ptolemy and the descendants of Seleucus begin to fight over Palestine. And again, for all the reasons I've told you 100 times before, it's control of trade routes. It's control of port cities. It's control of the flow of wealth and merchandise that essentially makes this land important. But here we have these Jews who have returned from Persian captivity. They've rebuilt the city of Jerusalem, and they've rebuilt a homestead in Palestine, and they're caught in the middle of this power struggle between the two factions of the Greek Empire. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. And when we take up in the future, this is going to play a major role. Questions, comments?
Just in addition, if anyone wants to go into greater detail about this period of history, the Great Courses Plus has a fantastic series of lectures about all of this in more detail.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really good.
You should know, by the way, this is like the view from 30,000 feet. This is a very, very swift overview. There's much more detail. Thank you. Good point. Anything else? All right, we'll continue next week. Thank you for your attention.